Okay, so we were talking about what a colony was. And we said a colony is, a formal colony is, you actually go there, you colonize that state, and you have a formal colony. And that is the narrowest definition that you can find of an empire, okay, of imperialism. A broad definition, so I'm going to take you from one extreme to another extreme, okay? The narrow definition would be you go somewhere, you invade it, you colonize it, now you have a formal colony. That's the narrow definition. On the other extreme, you actually have, on the other extreme, you actually have no colonies. You don't actually have any formal colonies, but you have a very asymmetric power relationship. So when I argue, if I argue that US is an imperial power because there are McDonald's everywhere, that would be a quite broad, a very broad definition of an asymmetrical power relationship. Okay, it's a very informal power relationship. There is a very strong state, and that strong state is trying to spread its culture in other countries. That would be, even spreading of culture to another country would count as imperialism. So the first one is one extreme, the second one is another extreme. Okay, they're both extremes. And we're not interested in this class in the extreme forms of imperialism. We will be looking at a less extreme form of it. But the more extreme form of imperialism is studied by many Latin American scholars, and it's called the dependencia school. And they think that a new, different form of imperialism exists in the world today, and they call it neo-imperialism, okay? And in that sense, they believe that, well, of course, the whole idea comes from a Marxist origin, and it says that, you know, the ruling class is actually trying to dominate the rest of the society by using international relations, okay? So you actually try to dominate another state and create an extreme asymmetrical power relationship with another state, so that other state doesn't have any other choice than cooperating with you. Okay, so Latin American scholars would argue that many Latin American countries have gone through this kind of a new imperialist situation with the US. Okay, so they criticize this asymmetrical nature of the relationship between a superpower and a weaker power, weaker state. Yes?
Could you argue that global capitalism has an imperialist force? For example, you could argue that the spread of McDonald's has less to do with the US now, but more to do with globalization and globalist culture.
Sure.
And, you know, the spread of media and it's less now linked to the US than it once was.
Sure, sure. Yeah. There are people who argue, there are scholars who argue that globalization is evil, because it actually spreads this culture to all nations, and everyone is becoming similar, and that's actually against the wealth of the cultures of the world. You know, there are so many different cultures, and that's a wealth from that perspective. So there are scholars who argue globalization is evil in that sense, and there are those who say, remember, kind of like the Gallner versus non-Gallner arguments. Gallner says nationalism is normal, you know, it's natural, and some scholars say globalization is natural. Others say globalization actually makes one culture dominate over others so that the other cultures become extinct. In that similar vein, the scholars or the ideas, schools of thought stemming from the Marxist thinking would argue that capitalism in its nature has expansion, the idea of expansion in it. And the idea of expansion, when it becomes a state ideology, it becomes imperialism. Okay? Yeah.
So then imperialism does not necessarily have to be linked to a state, but it can be linked to this global economic system.
Yes, from like I said, the realists and liberals would think that the main actor in the international system is the nation state. A Marxist, though, would believe that the main actor is not the state, but it's classes. So it's the upper classes versus others, right? It's the proletariat versus others. And when you actually, regardless of which state you live in, the proletariat are dominated by the others, by the upper classes. So you don't really have to consider this in terms of statehood. Okay? From a Marxist origin perspective, we're actually looking at class struggle and class relations. So it could be that all throughout the world, it's not the dominance of the US, but it's the dominance of one class over another class. Okay? So you can look at, you can critique imperialism. You can actually believe that today we have an imperial world where the US is trying to be the empire, you know, be the superpower, the empire, the expansionist power. And you find this kind of argument, especially when we talk about, you know, Afghanistan and Iraq, right? Invasion of Iraq, the missions in Afghanistan. So, what's that? Okay, in terms of Libya. In terms of Arab Spring, I read in the newspapers almost every day that the Arab Spring is staged by the United States. So you can actually go to as many extremes as possible, and you can argue that the whole world is dominated by imperialist goals, aims of imperial powers. And if you're coming from the East, you're going to argue that the West is imperial. Okay? So these are arguments that we see in international relations today. It's there are all kinds of, in the spectrum, there are all kinds of extremes of these arguments. Yes?
So what I understand is that the empire is the evolution of the state towards an economic organization rather than a political one.
An empire is both a political and economic organization, but at this day and age, the dependency school, coming from Marxist origins, believes that everything is based on economic relations, right? Marxism is based on economic relations. It's based on class struggle stemming from modes of production. So if you believe that empire is a political phenomenon, then you don't really believe that there are formal empires in the world today. They all collapsed by the end of the First World War. So depending on how you define an empire, your overlook of, or your view of imperialism, how you evaluate what imperialism is, will change. Okay? If you think of an empire as a strictly political entity, then you can't argue that there are empires today. If you look at the definition of empire from an economic perspective, and if you say informal or formal, if you have asymmetrical power relationships with another state, and that state is significantly less powerful than your state, then you are imperial. Your policy is an imperialist policy. Okay? So how you define an empire will change how you define imperialism, and it will change your opinions on who is imperialist. Okay? And also, one more thing, guys. Where you are from, do you have a colonial past? That also has a huge importance on your ideas. Like I said, the dependencia schools are largely Latin American. Wouldn't you be you know, wouldn't you think that it's normal that they come up with an explanation of imperialism that's closer to economic exploitation? Because it is, you know, Latin America is a former colony. The whole place was actually torn apart for its natural resources and all. So depending on that, you also consider imperialism differently. Now the definition that I'm looking at is an old definition, but still quite a popular definition. Doyle's definition. And Doyle's definition is kind of in the middle of the narrow definition and the extreme definition. Okay? So he says, okay, empire then is a relationship, formal or informal, in which one state controls the effective political sovereignty of another political society. So there is a political aspect of an empire, according to Doyle. It can be achieved by force, by political collaboration, by economic, social, or cultural dependence. So from that perspective, yes, if you actually have such a huge impact on another state, a political, economic, or cultural impact on another state, then we can talk about imperialism. Okay? And in this definition, actually, the American hegemony does look like it's imperialism. But if you consider imperialism as formal colonization, the US is a country that has been most against colonization, okay? So the argument may be that you can oppose formal colonization, but you can actually get what you want through other means, okay? And it is criticized by Doyle that the US and other Western countries have done that and are doing this, okay, to other states. So imperialism is simply the process or policy of establishing or maintaining an empire. What does this remind you of? You've read another person that I asked in the exam. What? Gilpin. Okay. You actually read Gilpin, and he was talking about how the British Empire collapsed, right? So empires actually collapse, and they did. The formal ones collapsed, but the ones that are not so formal, like superpowers, Soviet Union as a superpower, or the US during the Cold War as a superpower, those are not formal. But at the same time, the spheres of influences are huge, and they are competing with one another, which is accepted as imperialism. Actually, two different kinds of imperialisms. Okay, so from 1500 until 1960, imperialism was actually the norm of global politics. It was around for a long time. By 1960s, with the latest decolonization movements, independence movements in Africa, we have the end of formal colonization. But here's the thing. Imperialism, formal imperialism, still has its effects today. Okay? How do we know? Well, Philippines was ruled, not as a colony, but was ruled by the United States for a while. In the beginning of 20th century. So you have today in Philippines, you have a presidential system. And presidential systems are not very common in that area, in that region. But Philippines has a presidential system, it has a president, it has a Senate and a House, just like the American system. Now, why is this important? Because Philippines, as a result of its ties, imperial ties with the United States, it actually governs its people still in the same exact way that it did 100 years ago, okay, under American rule. So whatever you learn in your colonization period, you still carry the legacy of it, okay? African borders, you know, go open a map. I think I showed you before. If you open a map, if you look at African borders, and if you look at also some Middle Eastern borders as well, you have, you know, these neat lines where you can see that these borders are made on a map, actually, by the former colonizers. Why is this important? Because whatever your borders are, after the Second World War, well, after the 1960s independence movements, you can't change them very easily. So once the system is set, it's very difficult to change your borders. So you were mentioning Somalia and other cases last hour. You have all these issues as a result of imperialism in the past, okay? So before we start discussing if we have imperialism today, we actually need to discuss the effects of imperialism, the formal imperialism through colonies in the past. Okay, we're suffering from the consequences, and the dependency theorists are pointing to that. One interesting thing, you know, I went as an exchange professor, I went to the Netherlands for a few weeks, and I realized, and it was a small city that I went to in Groningen, and I realized there were so many Indonesian restaurants. And at first, I mean, seriously, I'm teaching this course, right? At first, I'm thinking, you know, there's all these Indonesian restaurants. There's so many of them. And they're very good. The food is wonderful. And I'm trying to figure out why there are so many Indonesian restaurants in the Netherlands. And then, hello, you know, of course it goes all the way back to Indonesia being a Netherlands colony. So the cuisine of the Netherlands is very much affected by its ties to Indonesia. But at the same time, Indonesia and Indonesia's economy and even the things that it trades are very much affected by its ties to Netherlands. Still, by the way, okay, former colonies and the states that used to colonize these colonies still have ties with one another. Now, I keep mentioning Rwanda, and in the case of Rwanda, Belgium's former colony Rwanda had ties to Belgium still in 1994 when the Rwandan genocide took place, guys. So that's why the Belgians were the first ones trying to get a hold of the situation, trying to contain the situation in Rwanda. Didn't work. But let me tell you one more thing. Belgians were the ones that Rwandans especially tried to kill during the genocide. So it was not only the Tutsis, but also the Belgians, because there was this whole, you know, rage against the colonizers. And although the Belgians were under the UN, umbrella, and they had the blue berets, you know, it was obviously not Belgium trying to contain the situation, but the UN. And it was the Belgian soldiers that were especially picked up and killed in Rwanda. So all these are pretty much the legacies of what happened in the past, okay? A result of the imperialist policies of the past. Now, having said that, why do we have empires? Why do we have imperialism? Why do states like imperialism? Why did they like imperialism in the past? Why do they still like imperialism? That's a question that IR scholars are trying to answer, okay? And Snyder has his explanation, but let's just leave him there for a moment. Magnus said, was it Magnus or was it Jela? Sorry, Jela said, so is it economic legacy? Is it the economic relations that leads to imperialism, that leads to the empire, economic concerns? Well, economic concerns are there, obviously, right? But is it only that? So there is a Marxist explanation that we put aside, and there is Jack Snyder's explanation, and his explanation is a little bit different, okay? He's actually looking at different interest groups' relations with one another in a state to be able to explain why a state becomes expansionist, why a state becomes imperial. Did you have a question, Raven? No? Okay. So he argues that, you know, all these power-based explanations, you know, are not on their own enough to understand imperialism. He actually believes that it's domestic politics between groups inside a state, plus their economic benefits and economic interests that lead to imperialism. In other words, he says it's us, the people who are inside the state, that makes the state more imperialist. Okay? So the reason an empire, a state becomes an empire, or a state becomes an imperial state, that a state implements imperialism in its foreign policy, is because the people living in that state wants that. Okay? They encourage the state. So you never thought that it might be the people, right? He actually thinks that there are certain assumptions in the minds of us, the people living in the state, okay, in a society. And those assumptions create the myth of an empire. Do you remember the cult of the offensive?
Yeah.
What was the cult of the offensive?
According to cult of offensive, if a country attack first, they take the advantage and quickly win the war.
Okay, and they will benefit from that, right? Yeah. So there was this irrational belief that if you attack first, you'll win. And it is actually the rational thing to do. But the evidence was against it, remember? The evidence was that when you attacked first, you're not more likely to win. Because wars become defensive after a while, and whoever is able to survive longer will win the war. So just like that, there's this myth of an empire, that empires actually, empires are good things, and that power is something that you should get as much as possible. There's this whole realist understanding in the minds of people that the more I get, the better. Okay? So the game is perceived as a zero-sum game. If Turkey wins, another state will lose. If Norway wins, another state will lose. That's far from Norway's foreign policy, though, right? Well, you don't know. Yeah, well, you never know, actually. So the whole idea here is, in this game, if I win more, if I increase my benefits, if I increase my gains as a rational entity, if I gain more and if I lose less, then I am actually, rationally, I'm doing something that's really good for me. So the game becomes a zero-sum game, okay? I win, you lose game. This is a very basic realist idea that you're already familiar with. So resources are scarce, and because they're scarce, I should get as much resources as possible. Wherever these resources are, whoever owns these resources, I need these resources. There is this constant idea of I need to survive, and for me to survive, I need more kind of idea. Okay? That's the first belief. And the second belief is our familiar cult of the offensive belief. If I offend first, if I expand first, then I'm going to win. And once I offend and expand, I can actually get the resources wherever I go, and so I can pay off for my expansion using those resources that I just conquered. As a result, you start thinking that expansion to another territory is cheap. Remember the cult of the offensive guys believed that offending is cheap? Actually, no. Attack weapons are usually more expensive. Okay? So just like that, you start thinking, okay, more power is better, more resources is better, I should get more resources so that I can be more powerful. And to be able to do that, I need to attack first. Once I attack first, I can expand. Well, expansion, because I go first, I attack first, expansion will be cheap. I don't have to spend too much on expansion. And one more thing, a third mode of thinking comes into this equation, which creates the myth of the empire, which is if I attack first, if I offend first, if I'm powerful, if everyone sees that I'm powerful, they'll bandwagon with me. Do you guys remember what bandwagoning is?
Yes.
What is it? What's that?
Siding with the powerful.
Okay, siding with the rising power, the challenging power. Okay? So if you side with Germany in the Second World War, you're a bandwagoner. Okay? Italy was a bandwagoner in the Second World War. So the idea here is, if you are getting stronger, and in the meantime you're aggressive, you offend, you expand, everyone will be scared and they will bandwagon with you. So they will join you. That's the thing that most expansioners will think that will happen. Here's the problem. Most of the time in international relations, the observation is that states will not bandwagon with the aggressive power. They will be threatened, they will feel threatened with the aggressive power, and they will balance against the aggressive power instead of bandwagoning. So did England bandwagon with Hitler? Did France? Did well, actually, Stalin first made an agreement, but then, you know, Soviet Union did not bandwagon with Germany. Okay, so there are very few examples in international relations that states will bandwagon with an aggressive power. Most of the time, what happens is balancing against the state that becomes more and more aggressive. Okay? So there will be a balancing act against it. Now, imagine this. You're expanding. You believe that expansion is a good thing. So you decide to expand more and more. Now, for those who are Turkish, you know a lot about the Ottoman Empire, right? One thing that we wouldn't, for some reason, accept is that Ottoman Empire was imperialist. Ottoman Empire is never considered imperialist. Isn't it interesting? Because we think of imperialism as something bad, right? Imperialism can only be something that's done by others. So we never actually argue that Ottoman Empire was imperial, but guys, Ottoman Empire was an empire.
But wouldn't it be required to be an industrialized society?
Have you seen it in the definition? No. An empire can be industrial or not. Pre-industrial or industrial. So being industrialized is not a condition for being an empire. Being an empire means you're actually expanding. Haven't we just defined being an empire? You're expanding. And think of your history background from high school. What did the Ottoman Empire do? Expand. We're proud that, I mean, I am proud that the Ottoman Empire actually expanded. Well, that's the logic of an empire. You probably never thought about what I'm just talking about, right? Okay, start thinking about it. From today on, I mean, empire expands. That's the thing about empire. You're watching, who's watching Muhteşem Süleyman? There's a show on TV that's about the... Muhteşem Yüzyıl, sorry. Okay. Sorry. Okay. In that show, don't you actually see, and you know, while you are watching, you're obviously becoming proud that Süleyman decides to conquer different places, right? You're not? Okay. Well, usually though, the myth of the empire is that, according to Snyder, is that it's the most, you know, it's the most normal thing to do for an empire to expand. There's nothing, you know, there's nothing to be surprised about. That's what empires do. And they expand because in the empire, the most important way of getting resources is by expansion. You go to another land and you get resources from that land. That's what, you know, that's what Ottoman Empire did. That's what all the empires in the world did. Okay? Call it a colony or not. As you expand, wherever you expand, you are actually expanding your borders. Okay? So from that perspective, you expand because you think expansion is the most logical thing to do. Because you want resources, because you want to get more powerful. So to think that getting more powerful is the best thing to do is a very natural idea. Okay? So from the empire's perspective, from the people living in these empires' perspective, the myth persists because sooner or later every empire collapses. It happens. I mean, it's a historical fact that every formal empire collapsed. Okay, so Snyder says, as a result, there's this whole myth about the advantages of being an empire, how great it is to be an empire. But in the end, all empires will, at some certain point, stop expanding because you can't expand endlessly. Okay? So that's why he says it's a myth. Expansion is a myth because at some point expansion will stop. Okay? And sadly, you're going to have to shrink after a while. Okay. So, according to this explanation, there is a group of people that will believe in this myth. And according to this myth, there is an advantage of being an empire. And this group, by telling one another how it is advantageous to be an empire, they will create a coalition, okay? Meaning they will cooperate with one another and they will form a coalition. It's called log rolling, okay, coalition. A log rolling coalition will consist of different parts of the society. Let's just assume, you know, you're farmers and you're, I don't know, like, what do you want to be? The military. Okay, I was looking at the guys, so I said military. So you're the military, you're the farmers, and you're different segments of the society. So in the society, there is a process of persuading one another that expansion is a good idea. So one group is coming up with this idea that the empire is a good idea, having an empire is a good idea for all of us. And then you actually cooperate with another group, and you have this log-rolling coalition that believes in hyper-expansion. Now, whenever I say hyper, you're going to immediately consider that this is not something good. Anything that's too much is not good. Your mom must have told you, right? Okay, too much of everything is not good for you. So that's a universal thing, I believe. Okay, so when you have a group of people coalescing with one another, cooperating with one another, and pushing the government to actually expand more and more and more, you actually get into a problem. And the problem is when you hyper-expand, when you expand too much, you won't be able to control your territories. Okay? So the whole myth of the empire leads to hyper-expansion because of the coalition of these groups with one another and persuading one another that expansion is a good thing because we need resources and expansion is cheap. We can get the resources from where we conquer. So that logic actually becomes a logic that creates the end of the empires, because hyper-expansion will bring the end of the empires. Does this resemble a little bit what Gilpin said a few weeks ago? What was Gilpin saying? Why was, okay, you don't remember. Why was Gilpin saying that Britain collapsed? Britain collapsed because it overextended. So he called it overextension. Remember? So overextension was not a good idea according to Gilpin. Well, Snyder says here, these different groups of people getting together, creating the myths of the empire, pushing the government to expand more and more, will eventually create hyper-expansion. What Gilpin talks about as overextension is similar to Snyder's hyper-expansion. Okay? In that sense, they're both talking about, you know, what will happen to empires after a while if they expand too much. What was the argument? If you expand too much, you're going to have too many nations to control. Always remember the first empire that you're familiar with. For us, it's Ottoman Empire. For my exchange students, I don't know, you will actually consider your own example. Okay? So as you expand more, it gets harder and harder to control the territory. Okay? And as a result, you're actually going to start spending more. That is the point where expansion will not be cheap. Okay? Yes, you're expanding, you're conquering other territories. As a result, you're getting their resources. You're sucking the resources from wherever you go. But in the meantime, you're spending more to actually protect the places that you have. Because other states also have log-rolling coalitions, and other states are also trying to expand. Okay, that is the point where the zero-sum game, you know, you started the game thinking it's zero-sum and thinking that you should get stronger and stronger. That is the game. That is the moment, in the end, that the zero-sum game will make you someone else's game, so that they will be trying to expand on you. Okay? The clashes will start. Again, from the show, the Ottoman Empire constantly fights, right? Constant fighting to protect your empire. After actually Suleiman, right, the Magnificent. After him, that's the peak of Ottoman Empire. After that, you know, the constant fighting is going to lead to exhaustion. So overextension at some point is going to lead to problems. Okay? What time is it? Seriously? Okay, I talked too much. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stop here, and we're going to talk about the exams in the next 15 to 20 minutes. And I want you to actually do the reading, the imperialism reading. Start the reading until Thursday, and then next week you should be finishing that reading, okay? All right, thank you.